All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today for our community conversation. We have another exciting program. Today we're focusing on active transportation in our community. So as per usual, I'm going to kick us off with a quick introduction to the work and why PCEC is doing this, and then I'll pass it to Erica to introduce our presenters, Sarah and Joe today. And we have an hour for today's presentation, and we want to make sure that we have time for questions at the end. So don't forget to mute your phone, and we encourage you to put your questions in the chat box as they come up, and then we'll do our best to get to everyone's questions at the end, and maybe ask you to unmute and ask the questions yourself or read the questions. So my name is Michelle Ibarraga, for those of you that don't know me, and I serve as the Executive Director for the Park County Environmental Council. We are your community conservation group. We work with the people here in Park County to safeguard the land, water, wildlife, and communities in Yellowstone's Northern Gateway. We do that through grassroots organizing and advocacy. So we live in a really incredible place, as you know, with gorgeous mountains, valleys that are home to grizzly bears, wolverines, migrating herds of elk, mule deer, pronghorn, bison that once freely roamed, wild rivers, wild lands, and more. In addition, Park County is the traditional homeland to the Absaloka, or the Crow tribe, and their ancestors who lived here for thousands of years. For the Crow and other indigenous people across the region, this area continues to be culturally and spiritually significant. European settlers who arrived in the 19th century were also drawn to the beauty and bounty of this land. So what is Park County today has a long tradition of human habitation, of people who have loved, cherished, and stewarded this place. And we are committed to working together to honor that legacy and this place for future generations. We've been hosting these community conversations via Zoom about growth and planning in our community for the past several years. And we actually moved to Zoom just recently. Our goal is to host conversations that help us as a community learn and gain a shared understanding of some of the most pressing conservation issues we face, so that we can be more knowledgeable and prepared to advocate for this place and our shared values. So there's a lot happening right now in our community. We've been seeing more and more people retreating to gateway communities like ours to live near natural amenities. This trend has been going on for years and has increased significantly with the pandemic. As people are moving to places, they want to be near the Yellowstone River, Yellowstone National Park, and wild, amazing places. But growth at the current rate can lead to problems traditionally thought of as big city problems, like lack of affordable housing, congestion, and income inequality, not to mention impacts on wildlife, habitat, and our water resources that are threatened from an ever expanding human footprint. So now more than ever, it is imperative that we are working together at the local level to set out a vision for how we want to grow in a way that maintains our unique character, safeguards and builds on what we love about this place, and protects our natural resources and way of life. So today we're going to talk about our built environment and trails, parks and trails. And I'm excited to pass the microphone first to PCEC's Erica Lighthizer to introduce our speakers. Erica, many of you know, has a passion for active transportation, and she has years of experience. She ended up in Livingston after she packed up her family of 3, including a baby in diapers and a black lab, and rode their bikes from Colorado to Montana. Erica is a certified League of American bicyclist safety instructor. She leads PCEC's public lands work. She just stepped down from serving on the state's Parks and Trails Board, and together with Sarah Stans, they are bringing a ton of energy and expertise and vision to PCEC's active transportation work. So with that, I will pass it over to Erica to kick off the presentation.
Right, thanks, Michelle. And thanks for that warm introduction. And yeah, I guess my kids have spent quite a few hours in the saddle in their lifetime so far. I'm really excited about our topic today. I don't know about you all, but one of my favorite ways to experience our community and any community with my family is on foot or on bike. We get outside, we get fresh air, We have casual conversations with our neighbors. Our dogs get to meet with their buddies. It's just such a natural way to connect and get outdoors. As Michelle said, especially now with COVID, our outdoor spaces are just incredibly valuable. And so I do spend a lot of time sort of geeking out on infrastructure and facilities that make it easier for our community to move in between the places they need to go, school, to work, downtown, and to places to get outside to have fun with safe and connected infrastructure. As you guys know, study after study has showed that investing in sidewalks, pathways, and trails really results in more resilient and healthier communities. So active transportation, what is it? It's how we move between all these necessary spaces. And the focus is on people-powered transportation. So it's running, it's walking, it's biking, skating, strolling, wheeling. There's so many ways to move. For the last half centuries, our communities have really changed the way we've moved and designed cities. Especially, we've really designed things a lot around cars. So this type of infrastructure, active transportation infrastructure, is really important to PCC and our planning efforts because we really want to design our communities for people first before cars. And we know that we make these investments in our communities, making them more walkable and bikeable, will all be healthier, and our communities will be attractive places to live, and we can preserve the wildlands that surround our cities. So if you want to pop to the next slide, I also want to talk a little bit about the Transportation Coalition. The Transportation Coalition is a local group of folks, city, county staff, and passionate advocates that promote healthy, active, safe, and connected communities for all residents and guests by engaging in thoughtful design and consideration for all modes of transportation. PCC has been involved in the Active Transportation Coalition for several years now, and my former colleague, Colleen, really took over the helm of the coalition back in, I think, 2017. Let's just get my notes. Some of the projects that you may have seen in the community that the Active Transportation Coalition was responsible for were notably the farmers market used to be open to cars. You could drive around River Drive there in around the band shell. And so we did a demonstration project, got a lot of feedback from folks, learned that it was much safer for folks in our community to enjoy the farmers market when that area of the road was closed off. So now, in partnership with the Livingston Recreation Department and Western Sustainability Exchange, we now have that area safer as a result of that demonstration project. We also partnered with the City and Parks and Trails Coalition to work on the Parks and Recreation Trails map, which I hope you've all seen in the community. It's in various places. And we orchestrated some demonstration projects like the pedestrian flags that cross Park Street, and also the bulb outs on 5th Street. And the value of these demonstration projects is for our community to be able to really test out these infrastructure improvements before we invest in them. So we got a lot of good feedback, some not so good feedback on the bulb outs that really helped us guide planning decisions in the future. And so now I have the pleasure of introducing Sarah Stans. She's bravely stepped into the role as coordinator for the Active Transportation Coalition. She is also a member of the Parks and Trails Committee and the Livingston Bike Club. She has her hands in lots of different things, all related to safe, walkable, bikeable communities. So with that, I'll pass it to her, and she can take us from here.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Michelle. Thanks for the lovely introduction and introducing Active Transportation Coalition. And thanks to Michelle for the acknowledgement to the Indigenous caretakers of the land where we gathered today. It's really exciting today. We really get to embed a lot of our discussions and what we learned today in many of the planning and policy processes currently underway in both the city and the county. So our ideas, vision, and all the things we've been talking about for our city can really be put into guiding documents, and priorities can be made a reality. So from a personal perspective, I see biking and walking as one of those superhero things that you do for yourself, for your community, your environment. And it really is just a cross-cutting solution to many of the challenges that we're facing today as humans, especially in the midst of COVID, the epidemic, where we really need to get safely outside and eat more, and we need to be outside more easily because it's never been more important for our physical and our mental health, as well as our environment. It was 30 years ago when I was 6 years old, riding my bike across town. I could go to school, under the underpass, like to the pool. And today crossing the tracks is really difficult. We rely on our cars and trucks, and a lot of kids aren't able to cross the street even to attend the park. And to play, like over on Gallatin Street and Katie Bonnell that I speak to specifically, mostly because of safety concerns and traffic. So other places I've lived, the best way to experience these new places and connect with people is through biking, walking, public transportation. It's convenient, it's affordable, and Livingston yet is the smallest place and the least populated place I've lived, and it's the place where I walk and ride my bike the least. So we've become subservient, reliant on our vehicles, even in our little town. It's even become part of our identity. We find ourselves then designing our streets and our transportation routes for more cars. This is a car-centric idea and car-centric design. I think it takes away our freedoms, our health, our connection to our community. At times it can bankrupt us, and it actually depletes our city budgets. So the fact is, if we are prioritizing parking, widening streets, and figuring out ways to alleviate traffic, we're only prioritizing car-centric design, which results in more cars, more traffic, decreased safety, less connection to our community, and this will have bigger implications for our mental, physical, and financial health, as well as the health of our environment. The ATC, we work to shift our thinking and planning from car-centered to people-centered. We increase walkability, bikeability of Park County and making sure every age and ability can move around our city, as Erica was talking about, with or without a car. So we're not asking anybody to get out of their cars. We just want people to be able to have the choice that getting in the car isn't the most convenient and comfortable way to reach places of fun and to complete our day-to-day activities. So our city, county staff, and resident coalition, we planned for connected community, and we use that design that supports people, different cultures, histories, and neighborhoods. We've done a lot of work recently, and I'm going to touch on some of the work since the COVID epidemic. It's been really remote, but we've attended a lot of city and county planning processes, incorporating a voice for active transportation.
Sarah?
Yeah.
Interrupt you real quick. The slides aren't advancing. So I wanted you to know, I'm not sure if you're looking at slides. We're still looking at the last slide that that Erica. Yeah.
Does that work? Are we up?
Great.
Okay. This one slide. So there we go. So providing a local voice, we're really getting involved in the Livingston growth policy process, hosting community walking and bike audits, assessing our streets with, where Joe will get into a lot of those details and how we look practically at some of that infrastructure. And we're trying to do this for all ages and all abilities. One of the recent assessments we did was identifying future growth areas and how do we move to and from these places that are proposed in the growth policy, assessing distances, safety, accessibility, comfort, and the future neighborhoods that are proposed. So we provided input to the city of Livingston to improve, to also improve the safety of Park Street crossings and to increase the visibility of our pedestrians and cyclists. So those are some of the work that, that we're doing, and we're not going to get into the details on some of those outcomes, but some of the high level obstacles that we face in Livingston are disconnected neighborhoods, Getting to and from those neighborhoods is really isolating, and it takes quite a confident and an aggressive cyclist. Not everybody has access to move through our town without a car. This is compounded by a lack of amenities and decentralized economic centers. So buying a gallon of milk or buying toilet paper requires everybody to get into their car. Some of these areas are over 4 miles to get from your home to the grocery store, for instance. There's also a very lack of apparent ADA design standards and sidewalks once you get out of the CBD. And then we don't have the neighborhood plans to kind of support what our neighborhoods are going to look like in the future that provide those self-sufficient commodities and opportunities. And then, of course, once again, our very car-centric culture. Some of the assets that we have in Livingston: compact. We're a community that walks and bikes all seasons of the year, despite the wind and the cold. And we have a lot of partners that Erica was touching on that have similar goals, like Livingston Bike Club, Parks and Trails Committee, Rails to Trails. The city county planning departments have really great people that are working in there and have great ideas, Parks and Rec and more. So what's most exciting today is last night the city moved on a decision to approve a consultant to work on the trails and active transportation plan. This was just approved, so work begins as soon as possible, and ATC is going to be part of that steering committee to get the best results and moving forward with some of those priorities. So while we're talking a lot about policy and processes for planning, it really is the bedrock that grounds a lot of our vision. And so I'm going to pass it over to our speaker today, Joe, and our expert, who's going to lead us down a little bit more of what this vision can look like on the ground. Joe is a leading national bicycle pedestrian facility design expert. He has a lot of experience living in Southwest and has worked on starting. He leads Alta engineering practice, including leadership, quality control of bikeway and complete street projects nationwide. He's managing projects across Rocky Mountain states, including work in and around Park County, as I said. And Joe has worked both as a project designer, planner, analyzing network connectivity and corridor planning. His expertise extends to project managing the first editions of the NACTO Urban Bikeway Design Guide, and he provides trainings with NACTO, NHI, the Department of Transportation in many states around the country. So with that, Joe, I hand it over to you, and thanks very much for joining us.
All right, thank you. I'm
gonna stop sharing, yeah.
All right, hopefully everybody's looking at, at a map right now. So again, my name is Joe Gilpin. I'm a principal with Alta Planning and Design. And unfortunately, I just moved away from Southwest Montana, been there for over 15 years and grew up partially in Bozeman as well. I have a lot of memories of bike rides. You know, my dad used to take my sister and I floating on the Yellowstone River, and he would, you know, leave us in the park in Livingston and ride his bike back down the highway to go get the car that we drove. And we were hoping that was something we'd hopefully be able to do before too long with the Rails to Trails project, and it could be kind of a neat way to shuttle and do all kinds of neat things. But I wanted to start today by talking about Montana in general and sort of what makes Montana unique, in my opinion. And I have a lot of experience in Montana. 2/3 of my career, or 3/4 of it was spent there. And I think some of the components that go into that are components that you all will be able to draw from in Park County, so and Livingston. So what you're looking at here is a map. This is a bit old right now, but I think it probably is going to still bear true. This is from the 2010 census. And what's really difficult in measuring biking and walking is the fact that we don't have a lot of data, and it's hard to compare states to other states. And so the one piece of information that we do have comes from the US Census, and it's basically about the journey to work. And it asks people at random times throughout the year, how did you get to work the most last week? And if you answered, I walked or I bicycled, that information is recorded. Now, there's a bunch of problems with that information. I'm going to get into it a little bit more, but what you'll see here is that Montana happens to be the #3 state in the country for walking and biking to work. Wow. That's pretty neat. You can see the size of these squares though, and these show kind of the overall magnitude. So while we're the number 3 in terms of percentages, you can see that California obviously has a ton more people walking and biking from an absolute standpoint. Now, let's see, this graph shows city by city throughout Montana. I don't have Livingston on here, but it shows the walking and biking percentages coming out of that census information. And so the census happens every 10 years. We did it last year. So I'm excited to see what comes out of the 2020 census. Now, the problem is we also had the pandemic. So I don't know how that's going to affect how biking and walking is reported during that time. But you can see that many cities throughout Montana have very high biking and walking mode shares that go beyond the, I believe it's 0.6% national average for biking to work and about 1.4% for walking. And so you can see that much, much higher. Now, the federal government also does a periodic national household transportation survey in which they ask you not just how you got to work. And again, the census is only asking you how you got to work last week. So if they ask you in January, your answer may be very different than in June. And also, if it happened to be raining last week, your answer might be different than it had been dry. So it's not really picking up the full amount of walking and biking that's going on out there. So the National Household Transportation Survey asks you about how you get around all the time. And it asks you how you get to the grocery store, how you get to your doctor's appointments, to school, to work also, and other things. And if we combine these two data sets, we see that there's actually even more walking and biking going on in Montana than in other parts of the country, because for every single transportation-based trip to work, there's other transportation-based trips, and there's also recreation-based trips that happen. So you can see these communities have much higher walking and biking mode shares. Well, a couple of years ago, we did the Bozeman Transportation Plan update, and we actually mapped walking and biking to work based on the census tracts that were around the city. And you can see that it varies wildly depending on where you are. And the really cool takeaway out of this map that is very visible is that big roads are huge barriers to walking and biking. So if you're familiar with Bozeman, you'll see that Main Street and North 19th both completely block off Valley West, which is where all the new development is going, from the places that you want to get to, which is downtown MSU and other places. And so I know that for Livingston, the growth that you're going to be experiencing, it's so constrained downtown. You've got the river, you got the railroad tracks, you got the mountain, has to go somewhere else. Will those places be able to have high quality, easy connections to those destinations they want to get to? If they have to cross a 5-lane roadway or a high-speed arterial, you can see what happens here in terms of what that does to your transportation-based walking and biking. Now, we all know that Montanans are pretty tough, and that's true, but there is still some seasonal variety. This comes from a trail counter that was down in Missoula, and it shows the seasonal changes in walking and biking. And you can see that walking is not as affected by winter as biking is, and biking is really a function of maintenance. If you can keep things plowed, people will continue to bike, and it's really that simple. If you go to Finland, their entire bikeway network in Helsinki and everything, crazy winters, very little daylight in the winter, tons of snow, and their biking percentages only drop a very small amount throughout the year due to winter, because they maintain their trails, and that's their first priority. Now, I mentioned the American Community Survey and the U.S. Census information as being, how did you get to work last week? So this is Missoula again, and this is the plot of the annual updates to the ACS. And you can see that it holds relatively steady. There is a margin for error because they're not polling a ton of the population. Well, in 2015, the city of Missoula decided to do a transportation survey, a statistically valid transportation survey in August and September. Good weather, and they asked people then. And we found that we're getting about double the percentage of people reporting that they rode their bikes for transportation during that time of year than what we were getting as kind of this aggregate of asking people all throughout the year if they were riding their bikes most often at that point. So again, I think that the data that's out there drastically underrepresents the amount of activity that is going on in our communities throughout the state. So back to the state, there is this bicycle-friendly community rankings. There are only 3 in Montana. I just checked these yesterday to make sure they're still accurate. And 5 years after I initially pulled this slide together, it hasn't changed. These are still the only 3 communities. This is from the League of American Bicyclists Bicycle-Friendly Community Report. And even though we have a lot of walking and biking going on, We only have 3 bike-friendly communities, and our state is ranked number 47 out of 50 in facilities and investment and policy and everything else. So clearly we've got a lot of potential on one hand and very little to show for it kind of on the other hand. So there is a ton of work that can be done. Some of it's not really all that difficult, but we're going to go through some of those things in this presentation. Now, again, what are some of the components that make biking and walking so good in Montana? Well, one is that our communities are fairly small. We don't have sprawling multi-city urban areas like Los Angeles and other major metropolitan areas. Our communities are fairly small. Now, the average walking trip in the United States is about 1.2 miles, and about half of those trips are less than a half mile. And with biking, it can go up to 4 miles, and a lot of it happens within 2 miles. So, this is looking from the furthest extent of the city limit to the city center and all of these communities throughout Montana. A lot of very bikeable, a lot of very walkable distances in here. So to summarize again, we've got really compact cities, short distances for the most part, high existing usage, and people that are fairly tough. But again, we have a low level of accommodation and investment. So I threw a 0.5 or a half mile radius and a 2 mile radius over Livingston. You can kind of see that's sort of the walk shed and the bike shed, if you will, of the city. And you can see that the entire community is within that bike shed. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of development maybe happening to the south, but those connections are going to be really important. Now, we have the people, which is one component, and that's going to unlock some potential. And I think the average resident of Livingston and Montana in general is going to be a little bit more willing to get out and walk and bike in both extreme adverse weather, but also just with the built environment that exists. There's a lot more that goes into creating what we would call kind of a well-balanced, active, and healthy community. I'm going to come back to this slide later, but I'll go through some of these core components. So this sort of shows all of the different areas. I'm going to talk about each one of these independently really quick. So I know that you all are going through a growth policy update right now, and this is something that's really crucial. We have to have a vision in the growth policy that says that the community wants to have a high quality of life, and part of that is making the ability to walk and bike easy, convenient, and something that is a rational and safe choice for anyone of all ages and abilities. And that's a huge component to doing this, because if we don't have that, then these ideas have to be permeating through every component of local government in order to work. So it needs to be in the growth policy, which establishes our vision. It needs to be in our transportation plans, because if we have a plan that talks about what type of, how many lanes our roadways are going to have, what type of level of service that they're going to be experiencing, at what date, what our intersections are going to look like in terms of number of turn lanes and everything, but doesn't talk about sidewalks, bike lanes, or trails, then we've got a major problem when those projects come up for construction and design. So a transportation plan in Montana, I found that a lot of them, and I've worked on probably most of the major cities throughout Montana, integrating in a really strong non-motorized section and doing it on equal terms with the roadway. So when you have a roadway recommendation, let's say Park Avenue or whatever is going to be at someday 3-lane roadway, the transportation plan should say that also, in addition to that, we've got 6-foot sidewalks, 7-foot bike lanes, or raised bike lanes, or whatever you want to have in there. It has to all be in that same project recommendation to work really well. And now I know that you all are about to embark on your active transportation plan for the community. And this is something that is really great to do, because the active transportation plan allows you to focus on this subject independently. It allows you to go really deep with the analysis, with the outreach. But again, there is a little bit of a risk in having an independent active transportation plan. It could become a shelf document. That's what we call something that sits on the shelf of planning offices and everything and doesn't get referenced on a day-to-day basis. So this has to tie into your transportation plan and be referenced in there. And ideally, the recommendations in this should match the recommendations that are in those other things. Now, there's another comp layer, which is kind of a recreation or trail-based plans. A lot of times active transportation or transportation plans are based on the word transportation. There's a lot that goes beyond that. This is your recreation or trails. So this could be your natural surface trails that go into the hills. These are your hiking loops. These are where you walk your dog. This is where you go mountain biking. Those types of facilities don't often live in a transportation plan. So we have to have this layer in addition to everything else that's going on from a transportation point of view and framework. So important to have as well. I don't know if you all have that type of a plan going on. Now, another key part of it is subdivision regulations. Now, in Montana, most communities govern their own subdivision regulations, and subdivision regulations are where you find out, are you requiring sidewalks? When do those sidewalks get built? Are they going to get built when the roads go in, or are they going to get built every time a house gets developed? They're only going to build that one little bit of sidewalk in front of the house. It also says whether sidewalks should be on both sides of the street, whether there should be connections if you've got cul-de-sacs between the cul-de-sacs so that kids can get to their friend's house a little ways away and not have to leave the subdivision and go around the outside on the big roads to get back to the other side. So there's a lot of really good stuff that if it can be built into the subdivision regulations at a high level, you're going to have some success. Design standards are huge. If you say build it and then your standards don't show how to build it, it leaves the designers in a hard way to look at that. So here's an example of a cross section that's telling you how to build a concrete trail, and obviously it's important to get that right, because if we don't build it right, it could have problems. So here's one that might have been too thin, and they drove a bunch of cars over it, or heavy trucks that were servicing it, and that broke up the concrete. We might also find that our design standards are saying put the sidewalk right alongside the travel lane. And we all know that when the plow goes by and the gravel's on the street, it gets kicked up onto the sidewalk. And then if that doesn't get cleaned, it's a huge hazard for everybody. And so, put the sidewalks back from the roadway. So that's not happening. This is Billings, and making sure that those are in your local design standards as well. So real quick, I'm going to go over just a couple of things. This is only scratching the surface. We've got tons of different types of intersection treatments, roadway crossing treatments, and everything. But I did want to talk about some types of on-street bike facilities. And one of those is a typical kind of standalone, standalone type bike lane. I know that there's a fair number of, we mostly have 2-lane roads in and around Livingston. Some of those roadways have some extra width. Some can be modified relatively easily. So I'll talk about how that can go. And that can happen via lane narrowing. We've got a wide travel lane, doesn't need to be that wide, but there's plenty of space maybe to fit a bike lane and a travel lane in. So nobody's losing anything. We're gaining something here. It's really easy to do. Sometimes you can just go put the bike lane lines down, leaving everything else the same. So that can work. There's also, if you've got parking that's not being used to its full extent, you can actually get rid of one parking lane and use that space to bring the bike lanes in. Here's an example of Peach Street in Bozeman where they did that. And before they actually had parking on both sides of the street. Very few people wanted to park on it because they were worried that their side mirrors were going to get clipped off. After they put the bike lane in, they actually had more people parking on the street afterwards because they had a wide parking lane to do that. In some cases, you might have to widen. This is a little bit more difficult to do and expensive, but it's not impossible. Here's a really long widening that was going on in Grand Teton National Park not too long ago. It shows kind of adding shoulders. And speaking of shoulders, always a good thing in a rural area if you have them. The top image here is the Shields Valley. Good shoulder. You can see that the rumble strip still has plenty of space beyond it for you to ride in or walk in if you need to. There's breaks in the rumble strip so that if you need to go around some debris or something else that's obstructing your path, you can do so without having to ride over the rumble strip. The no one here is between Bozeman and Ennis. That's an area that I used to go shuttle my family on my bike, and I'd be riding in that little 4-inch strip between the rumble strip and the edge of pavement. So not super fun doing that. So, bike lanes should be at least 5 feet wide. That's kind of the minimum. They can go up to 6 or 7 feet wide. Above 7 feet, they begin to look like parking lanes or driving lanes. And so you need to be able to do something else with them. But basic dimensions here. I'm going to skip over the next one. Downtown, I know that you have some diagonal parking on some of the streets, and front and angled parking. I just want to make the point that it's very dangerous with bike lanes because you can't see anything when you're backing out. So a way to get around that is to do what we're calling back-in angled parking. This has been around for about 20 years. It's difficult sometimes to get people on board. There actually is some reverse angle parking in Bozeman on Harrison Street near MSU. There's also some in Missoula. This is a bike lane in Missoula that had some rear back-in angle parking as well. So something to think about downtown. Now, I noticed in your parks and trails map that was shown a little bit earlier, there were some bike lane or bike routes designated around, and I think these have a lot of utility all throughout Montana. if you talk to kids and you say, where do you feel the most comfortable biking? They'll probably say on the trail, or they'll say on my neighborhood street in front of my house. And these local street bikeways are a way to actually take that comfort, and we consider, most people consider riding on a street that has few cars, and the cars that are there are traveling relatively slowly. Those are comfortable places to share the lane. Anywhere that you get speeds above 25 miles an hour or volumes that are above about 3,000 vehicles a day, that becomes much less comfortable because you're getting passed more frequently and at higher speed by vehicles going by you. And that is not something that most people feel comfortable with doing. But if it's just a single car here and there, and that vehicle is going slow and there's plenty of room, it's very comfortable and can be very comfortable to do. And so designating these routes with the use of shared lane markings, a big component to making these more comfortable is wayfinding signage. And I'm going to show you some examples throughout Montana, and I'll get into a really in-depth case study that I'm excited to talk to you about as well. And so here is just sort of how you might mark some wayfinding signage. Bozeman has a very basic system. It was put in 14 years ago or so, and not terribly good, but it helps a little bit. We found that giving people a bit more information about how far things are away, what direction you need to go in addition to, and then how long it might take you to get there is very valuable. And so we helped Jackson with this. They installed a huge system in 2013. And I'll talk more about this in a moment too, but that really helps you navigate. So if you're trying to get to the park, or you're trying to get to the library, you're trying to get downtown, or you're trying to find the trail that's going to take you along the Yellowstone River down 89, these are all things that the wayfinding system can help. So I mentioned some of these. I talked about the subdivision regulations. We talked about growth policy. Safe routes to schools is really important. Walking and biking to school is, kids learn better after they've had a little bit of exercise. Just a ton to unpack there with safe routes to school, but it's definitely a layer that you want to be thinking about in your active transportation planning. Maintenance, I talked about that a little bit, but making sure that maintenance practices, sweeping. About 10 years ago, Bozeman actually increased their street fees and used that money to improve the sweeping that happens in the spring and the plowing that happens over the winter for bike lanes and trails specifically. So that was something that really made a huge difference. And I noticed it right away moving around the community at that point. So another thing to think about is how you're funding this. And I wanna really kind of throw down the gauntlet here and throw a challenge out to the community of Livingston, that if you can build it, you can have a plan, you can have a really great plan, but what happens afterwards? And how do projects get moved forward? And so these are all things that I've found that have to be part of an entire system to have a community that actually moves forward rapidly. So if we're just relying on federal funding, if we're relying on MDT to come and add projects just by themselves, it's going to take a really long time to get projects on the ground. So these are some components that help. So we've got the federal funding, like I just mentioned. Let's see if I can get my mouse over here. You've got grants and foundations. I know Livingston has applied for build grants in the past. Those are a big, huge federal grant program. I still think that extending the trail further south in Park County is something that program could help fund. So really expensive projects sometimes. We want to make sure that anytime work is done on a roadway, that we're not putting it back the way it was. We're actually taking a moment to think about it and compare what's happening with the transportation plan, with the active transportation plan, so that when a resurfacing happens, such as here, and we're going to restripe the roadway, that we can put it in the way we want it to be and not just put it back the way it was, because you're going to lose 10 to 15 years every time that happens on the way that project. So this has to be institutionalized. Anytime you have new development, they need to build it the right way and not be a contributor to something that needs to be fixed or people having to come back to it later. We didn't build sidewalks for a number of years in our communities, and now we're having to figure out how to fund the installation of sidewalks, and that's complex, it's expensive, and it's a huge political football in some cases. Local staff time, I can't stress this enough. Communities a lot of times will either have a part or full-time staff member within them that is focused on moving these projects forward. So they're writing grants, they're working on the maintenance, they're sitting in on development review, they're part of the engineering meetings, and ensuring that those ideas and those components of all of these plans are being faithfully carried forward into all of the business of the city. And then this last one is local funding. And if we're just relying on everybody else to pay for your system, it's not going to happen very fast. There has to be some level of local funding. I don't know if that's a bond. Bozeman passed a Parks and Trails bond a number of years ago, and that provided $15 million for a lot of different things, but they did finish a couple of the big trails using that funding. There's also a pot of money, I can't remember how much it is, but they have every year, they put some money into an account that the Bozeman Area Bicycle Advisory Board and the Pedestrian Traffic Safety Committee are in charge of deciding what to do with. And so that helps move projects forward at another level as well. So I want to talk to you about Jackson Hole. And you may think, gosh, we have nothing, we're not at all like Jackson, but if you go back far enough, I would guess that Livingston and Jackson probably didn't look too different from each other. They've obviously been at this for a while longer, but I wanted to show kind of what some time can do for that. So I've been working in Jackson since 2007. I've probably done 15 or 20 projects now. We're right now updating their Pathways Master Plan. We did it in 2007, and we're doing a full update of that. Well, we're doing a project at level update of that right now. But the policy of it and the community support behind it has been really huge. And this was kind of an article showing the town engineer being really excited to implement this stuff. And we gave him some sketches in a 2013 document, actually 2012 document that showed what they could do downtown. And because this individual and his staff and his department was supportive of it, he was so excited that he literally went out himself and wanted to be involved in building all of this bike infrastructure downtown. And they've been at it a really long time. So we just came up with kind of where they've been. And this goes back to 1995, and it shows you that every year they do a little bit. And over time, that little bit every year adds up to a lot. And so you can see the system mileage of their pathway network. Now, this doesn't include sidewalks. It doesn't include bike lanes or anything else, but there is a lot of that there now as well. So they're up to almost 70 miles of shared paved pathway. And there's a lot of similarities. Here's what that looks like on their North 89 pathway going out of town. This goes through the Elk Refuge and connects up to the pathways in the Grand Teton National Park. They've got an incredible bridge. It's an 800-foot bicycle and pedestrian bridge over the Snake River. This was funded with a big federal grant as well. There was some local money and foundation money that was put into it. YDOT, they have a very unique relationship with YDOT. It's somewhat adversarial, but YDOT actually does respect the town a lot and what they want to accomplish. And so this was West Broadway through town, and YDOT built a raised bike lane that's behind the curb and much more comfortable for people to walk and ride their bike on to get into downtown. This is a 2-lane roadway. This is Snow King Avenue, and it goes kind of south of town. It's kind of a back way into the town without being on the state highway. It's been the only roadway with bike lanes on it for a really long time, and the citizens of Jackson have been demanding improvements year over year. So it wasn't a bike lane, then it was a bike lane, and then they added this buffer, and then they started putting these flex posts on it, and now they're saying this still isn't enough. We want it to be raised like West Broadway. And so it shows that you can still, every time, even if you get something done, it doesn't have to be the end product. We can still be thinking about these things. I mentioned the wayfinding system. This is a combination of pavement markings that tell you which way to turn, signage on the street, and then really involved trail signage that has vicinity maps and all kinds of stuff that goes along with it. Maintenance is huge. Excuse me. And our 2007 plan recommended that they spend between $7,000 and $9,000 per mile per year to maintain their system. That sounds like a lot of money, and it is. They've taken that to heart. They've figured that they're spending about $5,000 per mile. And that doesn't include mowing, plowing, and sweeping, but it does include all of the pavement preservation. So you can get a trail in, and then it starts to fall apart. And you saw this with the rail trail in Livingston until a few years ago when Park County came back and repaved it. And because they let it go a really long time, they had to do a major expensive structural replacement of that pavement. So if we do a fairly inexpensive seal coat on top of that pavement every few years, every 5 years or so, that extends the life out to like 30 years on that pavement. So a really cost-effective thing in the long run. And they fund this. They don't think about it when it's emergency state and the thing's falling apart, nobody can use it anymore. They think about it at the beginning, budget for it, and they have the funds every year to be able to maintain the system, and they know when they need to go. So one component of the Jackson plan, I just showed you that between 2007 and 2013, or 2007 and 2020, they basically built their entire plan. And so now they're at the point, okay, now what do we do? And so we're kind of taking that plan 2.0 and going forward. And so we use this interactive map. I think we may have proposed this on the active transportation plan in Livingston. So whoever your consultant is that's going to do that, make sure they have some kind of a really great crowdsourced information in there. But this one in Jackson, let me come forward and come back to it again. Why is Jackson relevant to Livingston? Well, your populations aren't that different. I think your kind of rural identity, the fact that you're a gateway to a national park, the tourism that comes through that provides seasonal pressures on the community. There's a lot of really amazing parallels between Jackson and Livingston. So in coming back here, we launched this web map, and this is a tool that we developed internally. Really easy to use. It's kind of like Google Maps. You can draw lines, you can put points down, a number of different categories. But we had 2,000 comments that came in through this map in the public. And they gave us points, they gave us lines, and we're right now refining that into a kind of a active transportation plan 2.0 that's tackling some of these harder issues. We're trying to get more community connections off the main lines. You know, we had a skeletal network, then it began to actually create a real usable network, and now we're trying to extend that usable network right to your front door. And so there's a lot of really neat things happening. And I think Livingston could have something like this in the future. With enough effort, with enough time. And with that, I'm gonna pass the conch back and entertain any questions.
Thanks so much, Joe. That was a lot of information packed into 20 minutes. You did an absolutely awesome job also making it so relevant to the Montana context and a lot of the challenges that we face today. And I agree with you, while we try to differentiate ourselves from Jackson, we have more similarities, just even being a gateway community to Yellowstone National Park. And I think it's something we can take a lot of lessons learned from. So to get some. So I'm going to open it up for, we have at least 10 minutes, if not more. So if you want to raise your hand, post it in the chat, wave your arms frantically. We're going to try to get to everybody on practical questions, and I'll leave my questions to the end just so that everybody here that's joined today can have a priority. So I've got Sabina Strauss. You want to go ahead and ask your question? Thanks.
Thanks. My question is, are we talking about the city of Livingston? Are we talking about county-wide?
In regards to the active transportation plan, or just everything that I've been talking about? I think it applies to everything. It applies to Park County, it applies to city of Livingston, but I know that the effort that's about to launch is for the city specifically.
Okay. I live in Gardner, and Gardner is working on a neighborhood plan, and a lot of local folks here raised the exact same comments and issues that you discussed. And I guess in the context of the neighborhood plan for Gardner, it makes, I don't know anything about planning or transportation, but from what I know, it would make sense that if Gardner has a neighborhood plan and we start talking about transportation, active transportation, that it's somehow tied into what the county's doing. And I don't know where and how and who how would we make that all work together?
Yes, so I think you can still be thinking local in the neighborhood plans. So you want anything that is going to extend outside of Gardner to be coordinated with the county, coordinated with MDT, depending on what it is. But you totally can think locally within your neighborhood plan. It's always a good idea for the county to be aware of and be a stakeholder as part of any process that is happening on the local level. You always want those folks in the room so that they can, you know, if they don't know what's going on, they're not going to be able to integrate it into their work as well.
So if I could just make sure I'm hearing you correctly, we want to put into the Gardner neighborhood plan as much as we are able to and as much detail as we want to. And once we submit it to the county, they would then become aware of what Gardner wants to do, and they would then make that part of the transportation plan for the county. Is that how I understand what you just said?
I can't guarantee you that they'll put it in their county plan. There may, you know, the things that are going to be affecting them are county roads. Anything that's going between built up areas would be something that would affect the county. Anything outside the Gardner limits would be something that would affect the county. But if it's within the Gardner limits and it's within your local roadway network, the county wouldn't necessarily need to be involved.
Well, Gardner's not incorporated, so we are part of the county.
Okay.
I think more specifically, and this may be a question for Erica or Sarah, I'm not sure, but there's been a talk about bike path or walking path from Livingston down to the entrance to Yellowstone National Park. And I want to make sure that whatever's happening in Gardner is connected to that bike path, because in my mind, that's really important. But I don't know how to make that work.
Can I maybe, Erica or Sarah, I would love to hear from you guys, but I just wanted to let Sabina know and everybody know that the Active Transportation Coalition is made up of city and county folks. And so it might be really awesome to have a representative from Gardner join that coalition. And I couldn't agree more with you, Sabina. It sounds like your process is moving in the right direction, but we want to check all those boxes to make sure that the coordination is happening with that big picture vision. So Sarah or Erica, do you have anything else to add there? And maybe you can speak to the Active Transportation Coalition and how we could plug in somebody from Gardner like Sabina or another representative working on that neighborhood plan.
Yeah, I mean, just to talk to Joe's point about how the communication in these points must go across all plans. Like, it doesn't just sit on a shelf plan, you know, that's totally isolated. So looking out for that. The active transportation plan for the county is currently being, well, it's in process of potentially being updated. Their current plan expired in 2020. And so how those pieces speak together has been a role of the Active Transportation Coalition, which was traditionally more city and county staff. And now we're really working to try to get more public participation in those conversations. And that's a lot of our work. Erica, do you have anything else that you want to add?
No, that was great, Sarah. And you're right, there is an effort that to connect the city of Livingston to Yellowstone via bike path. There's been quite a bit of effort in the county to get some engineering documents and plans together so they can start to raise funds for that. I don't know if Kristen Galbraith's on the call today, but she's really spearheading a lot of those efforts and is very closely coordinating with the National Rail Trails Coalition, which has identified a cross-country bike route that would connect coast to coast and come through Paradise Valley in their sort of initial concepts for that route. So there's definitely a lot sort of circling there. And so I'm so glad we're having this discussion today, because it starts to put those pieces and make those connections.
Are you good? Are you good with that, Sabina?
Yes, thank you. That's helpful. And I don't know if you guys saw the note from Jen Magic. I think sounds like we have enough people aware of this. So yeah, I think this is great. I just kind of want to make sure to put Gardner on everybody's radar, because sometimes Gardner gets forgotten, and we wouldn't want that. Thanks.
Thanks, Sabina. And we'd love to either take our contact details or mine, or we can take yours and rope you into those conversations. Thank you.
I'm not sure I'm the best person for the transportation conversation. I'm happy to be your contact at this point, but the Accessible Gardener Group that's working on the neighborhood plan might come up with another person that might be better suited, but either way, yeah.
Thank you. Rita, did you have a question that you'd like to ask?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
I had a couple. I'm south in the donut, and that area that goes under the I-90 is a nasty little area. It gets a lot of gravel on the sidewalk there, and you're right by the traffic. And I just wondered if that's used by both pedestrians and bikers. That area has some concern for me. And then we have a lot of trailer parks out in our part of town where people walk quite a lot to the grocery store and that sort of thing. And there's no sidewalks. And I just wondered what we can do to help make that better.
Is that a question for me?
Rita, or do you want?
Yeah, I can try to address it. So the underpass under I-90, yeah, it's a little tight. Not exactly sure if we're worried about gravel. Sometimes a barrier can be put up next to the sidewalk, and that way the plow does not actually get that gravel onto the sidewalk. You do have to make sure we're keeping the sidewalk clear independently, but that can be a helpful barrier that keeps that kind of grit into the roadway. As far as the sidewalk connections, that does need to be covered at the active transportation plan level in some type of a planning document. Sidewalk infill is a very tricky subject in the state of Montana, and I can try to find, once we're wrapping up, I'll try to find a link to this document, and I can throw it into the chat box. But we worked on a project with Yellowstone Health a number of years ago that was looking at sidewalk infill policies around Montana. And because sidewalks are typically the property of the homeowner instead of the city, and they're also maintained by the homeowner, they're a little bit difficult to make work. And so a program to be able to get sidewalks to connect, if they weren't put in originally with the development, can be challenging, because typically where does the money come from to do that? And so either the city needs to pay for sidewalks that are actually going to be owned and maintained by the local property owners, or there has to be some type of cost sharing program put in whereby people agree. And so there's been everything from property tax loans where you can pay off a loan to put the sidewalk in through a very small increase in your annual property taxes. Missoula has a really weird, they call it the health plan, where there's a upfront benefit that the city pays towards everybody's sidewalk infill, and then you pay this sort of increase if you have more sidewalk that needs to go in than that. But if let's say you're on a corner lot, you've got a lot of sidewalk on both sides, and that can be really expensive. There's also a out-of-pocket maximum where if you pay too much, the city kicks in again and continues to pay. So it's a really innovative model, and they've been putting in, I mean, Missoula had very few sidewalks outside the urban, kind of the core downtown area, and they've been trying to tackle connections to neighborhoods for a long time now. So there's a number of different ways that sidewalks can be funded. They do need to be planned, and typically we want some type of thought given to the prioritization. So it sounds like, connecting the trailer park to the grocery store would be a pretty high priority, given, just what I've experienced in working on those types of projects. So it helps having the plan done, and helps having that prioritization happen. And then the question becomes, how do we fund it? And hopefully the sidewalks, there's not, in addition to all of the challenges I just mentioned, hopefully there aren't, a lot of topographical or, utility type conflicts that would make it very difficult to install a sidewalk, because that happens all the time. One thing that we forget sometimes is we have the roadway, and then we put all of our utilities right where the sidewalk would go. And so if you're going to put a sidewalk in, sometimes you have to move utilities or work around everything, and they can be very complex projects in some cases.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to keep anybody longer than an hour. I'd like to stick to our time. So there's lots of planning, growth policy processes all happening right now. The real opportunity to make sure all these documents are speaking to one another. Up on the slide, there is the March 3rd, which speaks specifically to the transportation plan. However, tonight at 5:30, I think someone can put a link in the chat maybe for that. There's a Zoom conversation with the city's planning board to go over the extra territorial jurisdictions. Is that right? It's everyone gets that wrong, right? Looking at the map on where mixed use and different areas of where future growth could happen. Hiking and walking is in our neighborhoods even further. And while the growth it's fun and to plan for it, we're really focused on the infill and how do we make the places inside of our city now more convenient, comfortable, and with infill practical methodologies that benefit us more. So tonight, 5:30, growth policy on those maps, as well as community profile, which is really important in setting the stage and the scene. March 3rd, the transportation chapter, also with the planning board, and a Zoom call, public participation. And then the trails and active transportation plan, which the city is going to get to work on as soon as possible. We'll be hearing more about that. So within Active Transportation Coalition, you can sign up with PCEC, send us your email, sign up for the newsletters. We've developed a landing page within PCEC so you can get more information there and stay updated. And then there's the county updated AT plan too, and all these parts speaking together. And really nice to hear about the Gardner neighborhood plan that's also starting, and Jen Magic is going to reach out there. And that's all I have, and have a great day. And I hope you get out there and walk more and bike more and get your neighbors to do it too. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.